University as Students Against Israeli Apartheid. But unfortunately, I don't think I have enough time to discuss all of our challenges and a solution. So, alhamdulillah, at Mason it's been a lot better than other universities. So I want to talk about a strategy and a tactic that was integral to our success at Mason, and that I believe is highly misunderstood within our movement. And that strategy is anti-normalization. When I first came to Mason in 2011, there wasn't a visible presence of Palestinian solidarity, despite the large Arab and Muslim population. But there was definitely a proud Zionist presence. When I finally did encounter a Palestinian presence, it was accompanied by an Israeli one. This was part of the reason we had to form Students Against Israeli Apartheid at Mason, and why we are not SJP. Our SJP refused to adhere to the BDS call, which is a non-negotiable point when you're standing in solidarity. I think Abby did a wonderful job discussing solidarity, and inshallah that'll be a conversation that we'll continue to have. So we already have enough adversaries. We don't need to inflict any more harm on ourselves. So let me start. So I'm going to start with an analogy that will refer to verbal and domestic violence to introduce this topic. If anyone would like to excuse themselves, the analogy shouldn't last for more than a minute. So let's take a moment and think about a scenario where there is a woman in an abusive relationship. This woman has never been in a relationship with anyone else before. The only reality she knows is one of neglect, with verbal and physical abuse. Now, after much convincing, the woman and her abuser decide to go to counseling together. As they work on the relationship, it is the abuser who is applauded for having the strength to go to counseling. He puts on an act of genuinely trying to get better, while at home he continues to verbally abuse her. The constant ridicule is a part of her everyday life. Now one day the woman decides to speak up after being ridiculed, and her abuser responds by physically assaulting her. At this point she is justifying his attack, because she says she knows what triggers him and has brought this upon herself. Now what would you say to this woman? Does anyone think she should go back to counseling? Or should she end their relationship and demand that he be removed from her home? Stop? Okay. If you guys can interact a little bit too. So why, as Palestinians and Arabs, do we expect anything less than a total boycott of Israel and then isolating them from the international community? Can we see how the counseling only exposes this woman to more abuse, as does this sham of a peace process only further oppress Palestinians? Can we see how the negotiations only reward and applaud Israel, as do the counseling sessions for the abuser? Can we see the links between disproportionate responses to legitimate resistance? And can we see the links between victim blaming? So we're going to talk about what it means to normalize something and how anti-normalization can empower us in our struggle for freedom. Anti-normalization is a strategy within the BDS framework. So for purposes of today's conversation, let's think of boycotting and not normalizing as being one and the same. Now let's shift the discussion into the context of Palestine. PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, has done great work towards conceptualizing the framework of anti-normalization. We refer to normalization as a colonization of the mind. Okay, it's a colonization of the mind. Think about that. Where the oppressed come to believe that the reality that they are subjected to is the only normal reality that they must be subscribed to, and that oppression is a fact of life that must be coped with. PACB has defined normalization as the participation in any event, initiative, or activity in Palestine or internationally that aims to bring together Palestinians and/or Arabs and Israelis without placing as its goal resistance to and exposure of the Israeli occupation and all forms of discrimination and oppression against Palestinian people. Now, before I introduce the strategy of anti-normalization, I want to preface this discussion with the understanding that this strategy does not discriminate against individuals, but targets institutions that attempt to normalize the occupation. So this does not mean that you cannot work with Israelis or Jews, as many people might say when they hear this. That being said, individuals who are complacent or complicit with organizations and institutions that strive to undermine the self-determination of Palestinians are not protected from being sanctioned. To help us better understand this concept, we're going to work within two frameworks. So we have coexistence and co-resistance. Coexisting would be to normalize, and co-resisting would be to challenge the discriminatory and colonial policies of Israel's regime. And many of us, unfortunately, are familiar with the notion of coexistence. The majority of the world has been deceived into believing that the problem between Palestinians and Israelis lies in an inability to coexist, where in fact we know that this is false. Many normalizing projects are often centered around this idea of peace and understanding and showing that we're not so different after all, but they completely ignore the ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestine. Analogous to the non-peace process, the subject matter of these dialogues are limited. Talk of a Nakba, settlements, the occupation is all considered too political. It's very important that we understand the differences in this framework. Any project or activity that does not begin with the shared principles of resisting Israel's oppression of Palestinians only serves to further perpetuate the notion that we can continue to live under oppressive conditions prior to or leading to the end of oppression. If you have trouble understanding it in this context, refer back to our abusive relationship. It should help us contextualize it further. So what would a project like this look like? I'm sure many of us have been invited to different dialogue groups, the tokenization of Palestinians, where if we wanted to attend, we would talk about each other's narratives and eat hummus and learn to overcome our differences. Those are what normalizing projects look like. But it doesn't have to be so obvious. They can take shape in the form of joint events such as movie screenings with organizations such as J Street, Hillel, or the Israel Student Association. It should be obvious that these are institutions that support the occupation. Now, what does it mean to co-resist? Co-resistance conversely begins with a commitment to resist Israel's oppression and recognizes the necessity of the fulfillment of the demands of the BDS call, which Lena put so eloquently. But in essence, basically any event that morally or politically equates the oppressor and the oppressed, presenting the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis as symmetrical, should be boycotted. Now that we have an understanding of the framework in which we function, I'm going to move on to some of the adverse effects of normalizing, as well as how anti-normalization can empower our movement. So it creates a facade of equals. First and foremost, normalizing's most detrimental effect is its ability to create a false parity amongst the two sides. Again, further perpetuating the notion that Palestinians and equals are Palestinians and Israelis are equals with petty differences over land and religion. We must show that the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis, for what it really is, a relationship of an oppressor and the oppressed, and a colonizer and the colonized. I have yet to come across any photographs of white Afrikaners and black South Africans linking arms as they exploited them for labor. Yet to see the Algerians and the French just hanging out. We don't see pictures of Jews and Nazis as they're smiling as they force them into concentration camps. So you shouldn't see it with Palestinians. One of the critiques I often hear is, Tareq, how will they know what we want if we don't convince them to engage into these dialogues? First, this logic is exemplary of the effects of normalization. It allows us to assume that we were in fact equals with the ability to negotiate our demands. The power dynamic is completely skewed. One of my great friends, Professor Dr. Craig Wilsey, came up with another analogy to accurately describe this relationship. So most of us here should be students, but it's okay. I'm sure all of us will be able to do this. So imagine you receive a grade on a paper that you don't agree with, or an assignment that you think is too difficult. Now you can go to your professor during their office hours and have a dialogue with them and talk about your grade and the content of the assignment, correct? Yeah. No?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, that decision lies with the professor, right? The outcome of that dialogue is predetermined. So can we see how that's similar?
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, when people perceive us as equals, it only serves Israel because it makes us lose our bargaining power. No longer are we an oppressed people with demands, but we are two people with equal grievances amongst each other. As the disparity amongst us diminishes, so does the magnitude of our demands. So the next thing that normalizing does is it eases the oppressor's mind and puts the blame on the oppressed. Here we come back to the links with victim blaming, and there's a lot of intersectionality this here. So not only do you legitimize the Israeli regime's right to exist when you normalize, but you also inadvertently ease the mind of the oppressor. You allow them to believe there's a human cost on both sides, while forgetting the reason that anything bad will happen to them as a result of their own actions. Someone recently attempted to try and have me sympathize with IDF soldiers who suffer from PTSD. Like, really? Completely ignoring the fact that a majority of children in Gaza suffer from PTSD as a result of those very soldiers' actions. So here we are opening the door for the oppressor to be the oppressed. We play an audience to what is and isn't legitimate resistance. We give a platform to cover up 66 years of ethnic cleansing with a critique of a symptom of their own occupation. In essence, you allow someone who plays in the rain to complain when they get wet. We must never allow our opposition to forget their identity, which is that of a colonizer. When you engage in normalization, you either ignore the discriminatory policies Israel enjoys or accept them as the status quo that can be lived with. You accept a two-tier system of rights based on the supremacy due to one's religion. You accept the fact that you have no guarantee to see parts of your home. You accept Israel's denial of the right of return. You say yes to checkpoints, a fake history, and the denial of the crimes committed against you and your families. You say yes to a future as oppressive as our present. Well, I say no, and I'm not alone. It's difficult for some of our generation to understand this concept because we're the post-Oslo generation. We've only been invited to speak of our plight through the framework of Israel being hand-in-hand our partner in peace, rather than the oppressive foot that is keeping us down. Hassan Kanafani, before he was killed by the Mossad, used to say, he is wrong who says that we are the generation of revolution. Rather, we are the generation who will give it life. And we are that generation. Anti-normalization empowers us with the ability to rise above. No longer does the oppressor have a say in their future. Before Palestinians can finally have the right to self-determination, and I don't mean the kind that Obama and Netanyahu talk about, we must strip Israel of their colonial privilege and expose it for the undemocratic racist state it is. Anti-normalization empowers us with the ability to change this power dynamic. We refocus on what is and isn't truly realistic. For us to believe that it is realistic to convince our colonizers to shed their colonial privilege is ludicrous. We have not seen a single example of this in history. Oppressive regimes and discriminatory institutions do not decide one day over hummus to relinquish their power. They are forced. They are forced through international solidarity. They are forced through boycotts. They are forced when their country's legitimacy no longer exists. So let's stop granting our oppressors legitimacy and stop normalizing terror.